The morning sun painted the Montana sky orange as Ben Walker stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 42 years old, he had been running the Double Creek Ranch completely alone for 15 long years. The silence that surrounded him was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Ben's day started the same way it had for the past 5,000 mornings. He would check on the cattle, mend whatever fence the weather had damaged, and try to keep the ranch running the way his father had taught him. The work was hard, but it kept his mind busy. It stopped him from thinking too much about how quiet everything had become. His father had died when Ben was 27, leaving him with 800 acres of land, 200 head of cattle, and a house that suddenly felt too big for one person. His mother had passed away 3 years before that. And since then, the ranch house had slowly transformed from a warm family home into something that felt more like a workplace than a place to live. The kitchen table where his family once shared meals now held only his coffee cup and whatever book he was reading. The living room where his parents used to sit by the fire in the evenings now collected dust. Most nights, Ben fell asleep in his father's old chair, too tired to make it to his bedroom upstairs. People in town had tried to help him find companionship over the years. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, was always mentioning some nice young woman who had moved to the area. The preacher's wife would invite him to church dinners where single ladies just happened to be seated near him. Even old Joe Miller, who owned the neighboring ranch 20 miles away, had tried to set him up with his niece when she came to visit, but Ben had politely declined every invitation, every introduction, every well-meaning attempt at matchmaking. He told people he was too busy with the ranch, too set in his ways, too comfortable with his routine. The truth was more complicated than that, though he never said it out loud. The truth was that Ben had learned to fear losing people. When his mother died, it felt like the sun had stopped shining. When his father followed her 3 years later, Ben thought his heart might actually stop beating. The pain of those losses had been so intense that he decided it was easier to live alone than to risk feeling that kind of hurt again. So he built walls around himself, not just emotional ones, but physical ones too. He rarely went to town except when he absolutely had to buy supplies. He kept his conversations with neighbors short and focused on business. He convinced himself that solitude was a choice, not a prison. His daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. He would wake up before dawn, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and head out to check on his animals. The cattle knew him so well that they would start moving toward the watering holes before he even reached them. His horse Thunder seemed to understand his moods better than any human ever had. In the afternoons, Ben would work on whatever needed fixing. There was always something broken on a ranch this size. A fence post rotted by the weather, a gate that wouldn't close properly, equipment that needed repairs. The work was endless, but it filled the hours between sunrise and sunset. Evenings were the hardest time. That's when the silence felt the heaviest, when the empty room seemed to echo with memories of laughter and conversation. Ben had tried reading books, but they reminded him of his mother who had loved stories. He had tried listening to the radio, but the voices made him feel even more alone. Most evenings he would sit on the front porch and watch the sun disappear behind the mountains. The view was beautiful, with rolling hills stretching as far as the eye could see. But beauty felt different when you had no one to share it with. Sometimes he would catch himself starting to point out a particularly spectacular sunset to someone, only to remember that no one was there. The townspeople thought Ben was just a confirmed bachelor, a man who preferred his own company to anyone else's. They respected his choice and eventually stopped trying to change his mind. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed the way his shoulders slumped a little more each year, or how his smile had become something he put on when he went to town rather than something that came naturally. Ben had convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could live a full life with just his animals and his work for company. He told himself that he didn't need conversation or companionship or someone to share his meals with. He had built such a strong wall around his heart that he genuinely believed he was content. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed his thoughts to wander, Ben knew something was missing. He could feel it in the way his chest tightened when he saw couples at church, or in the way he lingered at the general store just to hear Mrs. Patterson chat about her grandchildren. He could feel it in the way he talked to Thunder more than was probably normal, or in the way he sometimes set 2 plates on the table out of habit, before remembering he only needed one. The ranch was successful. His cattle were healthy and his land was beautiful. By most measures, Ben Walker was a fortunate man. But as he stood on his porch that morning, drinking his coffee and watching another day begin exactly like all the others, he couldn't shake the feeling that life was passing him by while he stood still, afraid to reach out and grab hold of something real. He had no idea that in just a few hours, a dusty stagecoach would pull up to his gate, carrying someone who would change everything. He had no idea that his carefully constructed life of solitude was about to be turned completely upside down by a woman who wasn't even supposed to be there. The sound of wagon wheels crunching on gravel broke through the afternoon quiet like thunder in a clear sky. Ben Walker looked up from the fence post he was repairing, squinting against the sun to see a dusty stagecoach approaching his gate. His heart started beating faster. In 15 years of living alone, unexpected visitors were about as common as snow in July. The coach came to a stop with a cloud of dust, and Ben watched in complete bewilderment as the driver climbed down and opened the passenger door. Out stepped a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and a traveling dress that had seen better days. She carried a worn carpet bag and looked around with the expression of someone who wasn't quite sure where she was. Ben dropped his hammer and walked slowly toward the gate, his mind racing. He didn't know any women who would have reason to visit his ranch. He didn't know any women at all, really, except for the few he nodded to politely when he went to town for supplies. The stagecoach driver was already unloading a small trunk from the back of the coach. The woman handed him some coins, said something Ben couldn't hear, and the driver tipped his hat before climbing back onto his seat. Within minutes, the coach was disappearing down the road in another cloud of dust, leaving the woman standing alone at Ben's gate. She looked around for a moment, then picked up her carpet bag and started walking up the path toward his house. Ben stood frozen, watching her approach. She had a determined way of walking, like someone who had made up her mind about something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. When she reached the porch, she set down her bag and smoothed her skirts before looking directly at him. Her eyes were dark brown and serious, and she had the kind of face that looked like it smiled often, though she wasn't smiling now. "Mr. McKinnon," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that sounded like it might be from somewhere down south. "I'm Clara Santos, from the matrimonial agency in San Antonio." Ben blinked at her, completely lost. "I'm sorry, miss, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. My name's Ben Walker, and I don't know anything about any matrimonial agency." Clara's face went pale, and she reached into her bag to pull out a folded piece of paper. Her hands were shaking slightly as she unfolded it and read it again, as if hoping the words might have changed since the last time she looked. "This says to come to the ranch on Double Creek Road, about 5 miles past the old oak tree with the lightning scar," she said, her voice getting smaller with each word. The letter said Mr. Thomas McKinnon was looking for a wife, and that he lived alone on his ranch, and she trailed off as the reality of the situation sank in. Ben could see the exact moment when she realized what had happened, and his heart went out to her. She looked like someone who had just watched her entire future crumble in front of her eyes. "Ma'am," Ben said gently, "I think you're looking for Thomas McKinnon. He lives in town, runs the dry goods store. He's about 15 miles from here in Cedar Falls proper." Clara sank down onto his porch steps, still holding the letter. "But the directions. They said the ranch on Double Creek Road. That's what this is, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am, but there's more than one road with that name in these parts. The town has a Double Creek Road, too, where the creek runs right through Main Street." Ben felt terrible for her. The agency must have gotten the directions mixed up. For a long moment, Clara just sat there staring at the letter. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in her bag. When she looked up at Ben, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin was set in a way that told him she wasn't the type to fall apart easily. "I spent every penny I had to get here," she said quietly. "The stagecoach fare, the train ticket from San Antonio. I don't have money to get back home, and I certainly don't have money to hire another coach to take me to town." Ben felt something twist in his chest. Here was this woman, clearly brave enough to travel hundreds of miles to marry a stranger, and through no fault of her own, she was stranded at his ranch with nowhere to go and no way to get there. "How did you end up?" he started to ask, then stopped himself. It wasn't really his business why a woman would answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. But Clara seemed to understand what he was asking. My father died last year, she said, looking out at the mountains in the distance. He left some debts that I had to pay, and there weren't many options for a woman to earn enough money to live on her own. The matrimonial agency seemed like the best choice out of several bad ones. Ben nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. People did what they had to do to survive. He couldn't judge anyone for making hard choices when life backed them into a corner. Ma'am, I hate to ask this, but do you have any idea where Mr. McKinnon might think you are? Like if you don't show up, will he come looking? Clara shook her head. The letter said he would be expecting me today, but it didn't say anything about what to do if something went wrong. I suppose he'll just think I changed my mind. A thought occurred to Ben that made his stomach drop. When did you leave San Antonio? 4 days ago. I took the train to Billings, then the stagecoach from there. Ben ran a hand through his hair. If she had been traveling for 4 days and Thomas McKinnon was expecting her today, there was a good chance the man had already given up on her and made other arrangements. Ben had seen Thomas around town with a widow named Catherine Fisher, and people had been saying they seemed fond of each other. But he didn't want to add to Clara's worries by mentioning that possibility. One crisis at a time. Well, he said, surprising himself with what came out of his mouth next. You can't sit out here on my porch all evening. Why don't you come inside and we'll figure out what to do? I can take you to town in the morning and we'll sort this whole thing out. Clara looked up at him with something like relief in her eyes. I don't want to impose on you, Mr. Walker. You don't know me, and this isn't your problem. Maybe not, Ben said, but it's not your fault either. And I can't very well leave you sitting out here with nowhere to go. As he helped her carry her trunk into the house, Ben couldn't help but think that this was probably the strangest thing that had ever happened to him. An hour ago, his biggest concern had been fixing a broken fence post. Now he had a woman in his house who was supposed to marry someone else, and he had no idea what tomorrow was going to bring. Ben led Clara through his front door, suddenly aware of how the house must look to someone else's eyes. He hadn't had a visitor in years, and it showed. Dust covered most surfaces, newspapers were stacked in corners, and his coffee cup from that morning still sat on the kitchen table next to a plate with crumbs from his breakfast. I'm sorry about the mess, he said, genuinely embarrassed. I don't usually have company. Clara looked around the main room, taking in the faded furniture and the cobwebs in the corners. But instead of the disgust or dismay Ben expected to see on her face, she just nodded as if she understood completely. It's fine, she said. You weren't expecting anyone. Ben showed her to what had been his parents' bedroom, opening the door to a room that hadn't been used in 15 years. The bed was still made with his mother's quilt, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. He felt his face burn with shame as he looked at it through Clara's eyes. I know it's not much, he said, already moving to strip the dusty bedding. I can get some clean sheets and there's a basin over there for washing. The room gets good light in the morning and it's got its own window for air. Clara set her carpet bag down carefully and walked to the window, looking out at the view of the mountains. It's beautiful, she said, and Ben could tell she meant it. I haven't seen mountains like this since I was a little girl. While Ben went to find clean bedding, Clara stood in the room that would be hers for the night. She could tell it had belonged to a woman once. There were little touches that only a woman would add. A small mirror on the dresser, a rocking chair by the window, and lace curtains that had probably been white once upon a time. She wondered about Ben Walker's family, about what had happened to the people who had lived in this house before him. The sadness in his eyes when he looked around the room told her there was a story there. But she didn't feel right asking about it. When Ben returned with fresh sheets and a clean towel, Clara was already organizing her few belongings. She didn't have much, a few dresses, some undergarments, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a small wooden box containing the few pieces of jewelry she hadn't had to sell. Ma'am, Ben said, setting the bedding on the dresser, I should probably mention that I'm not much of a cook. I usually just make coffee and beans, maybe some bread if I remember to. I don't want you to go hungry, but I'm afraid I can't offer you much in the way of a proper meal. Clara turned to look at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. It transformed her whole face, making her look younger and less worried. Mr. Walker, I've been cooking since I was 10 years old. If you don't mind me using your kitchen, I'd be happy to make dinner for both of us. It's the least I can do. Ben felt something strange happen in his chest when she smiled. It had been so long since anyone had smiled at him like that. warm and genuine and without wanting anything from him except permission to help. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "The kitchen's got most everything you'd need, I think. Though I should warn you, I haven't done much cooking beyond the basics." Clara nodded and followed him to the kitchen, where she immediately began opening cabinets and drawers, taking inventory of what was available. Ben watched her work, fascinated by how she seemed to know exactly where to look for things, how she could assess what needed to be done just by looking around. "You've got good bones here," she said, running her hand along the wooden countertop. This kitchen was built by someone who knew what they were doing. The layout makes sense and there's plenty of space to work. Ben felt a rush of pride that surprised him. "My father built this house when he married my mother. He wanted to make sure she had everything she needed." "He sounds like a good man," Clara said gently. "He was," Ben replied, then cleared his throat and changed the subject. "I should probably go finish up with the animals while you're getting settled. I usually do the evening chores around this time." Clara nodded and continued her exploration of the kitchen. Ben headed outside but found himself moving slower than usual, his mind occupied with thoughts of the woman in his house. It felt strange to know that someone else was moving around in those rooms, opening his cabinets, making herself at home. When he came back inside an hour later, the kitchen smelled like heaven. Clara had found some potatoes in his root cellar, along with carrots and onions, and had somehow transformed them into a stew that made his mouth water. Fresh bread was cooling on the counter, and she had even managed to make coffee that didn't taste like it could strip paint. "How did you do all this?" he asked, genuinely amazed. "You had more supplies than you realized," Clara said, ladling the stew into bowls. "You just needed someone to put them together properly." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and Ben couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a meal that tasted this good. But more than that, he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten with another person, had someone to talk to while he ate. "This is delicious," he said, and meant it. "Thank you," Clara replied. "My mother taught me that there's no problem so big that a good meal can't make it seem a little smaller." As they ate, they talked carefully about safe subjects: the weather, the beauty of the countryside, the differences between Montana and Texas. Clara told him about the long journey from San Antonio, about the kindness of strangers who had helped her along the way. Ben found himself talking more than he had in months, drawn out by her easy way of listening. When they finished eating, Clara insisted on washing the dishes while Ben dried them. It was such a simple domestic scene, but it felt revolutionary to Ben. For 15 years he had eaten alone, cleaned up alone, and gone to bed alone. Having someone to share these ordinary tasks with made them feel less like chores and more like, well, like life. As Clara handed him the last clean plate, their fingers brushed for just a moment. Both of them froze, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how intimate this simple evening had become. "I should probably turn in," Clara said quickly, stepping back from the sink. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Ben nodded, though he found himself reluctant to see the evening end. "Of course." "And Clara, thank you. For dinner, I mean. It's been a long time since this house felt like a home." Clara looked at him for a long moment, something soft and understanding in her eyes. "Thank you for taking me in, Ben. Not many men would have been so kind to a stranger." As she disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door behind her, Ben stood in his kitchen looking around at the clean dishes, the swept floor, the lingering smell of fresh bread. For the first time in 15 years, his house felt alive again. He sat in his father's chair by the fireplace, but instead of falling asleep there as he usually did, he found himself staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of Clara moving around in the room above. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, whether Thomas McKinnon would still be interested in marriage, whether Clara would disappear from his life as suddenly as she had appeared in it. The thought of her leaving made something twist painfully in his chest, which surprised him. He barely knew this woman, had known her for less than a day. But already the idea of going back to his silent, empty house felt unbearable in a way it never had before. Ben woke up to the sound of something he hadn't heard in his house for 15 years. Someone else moving around in the kitchen. For a moment, lying in his bed as the first light of dawn crept through his window, he thought he might be dreaming. Then the smell of coffee and bacon reached him and he remembered. Clara was here, He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, finding Clara already at the stove with her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled back. She had found his mother's old apron hanging in the pantry and was wearing it over her dress. The sight of her in his kitchen looking so at home made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. "Good morning," she said, turning to smile at him. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I'm used to getting up early and I thought you might be too, what with the ranch work and all." "I don't mind at all," Ben said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. It was perfect, strong but not bitter, the way his mother used to make it. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," Clara admitted. "It's been a long time since I felt safe enough to really sleep." Something in the way she said it made Ben look at her more closely. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just one bad night, and a wariness in her posture that suggested she was used to being on guard. "Safe?" he asked gently. Clara was quiet for a moment, focusing on turning the bacon. "Things got difficult after my father died," she said finally. "The people he owed money to weren't always patient about waiting for payment. And when you're a woman alone, well, some men think that gives them certain rights." Ben felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of anyone threatening Clara, which surprised him with its intensity. He barely knew this woman, but the idea of someone hurting her or scaring her made him want to hit something. "You're safe here," he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you," she said simply. After breakfast, Ben prepared to head out for his morning chores, expecting Clara to stay in the house. Instead, she appeared at the kitchen door wearing a practical brown dress and sturdy boots, asking if she could come with him. "It's dirty work," Ben warned her, "and some of it's not exactly suitable for a lady." Clara raised an eyebrow at him. "Mr. Walker, I grew up on a farm. I know what dirty work looks like, and I know which end of a cow gives milk. I'd rather keep busy than sit in the house worrying about what's going to happen when we get to town." Ben found himself grinning at her frank way of speaking. Most of the women he knew would have been horrified at the suggestion of doing farm work, but Clara seemed to view it as a perfectly normal way to spend the morning. His first stop was the chicken coop, where he usually spent 10 minutes chasing chickens around trying to collect eggs. But Clara stepped into the coop like she had been doing it all her life, speaking softly to the hens and gathering eggs with an efficiency that left Ben standing outside feeling useless. "You've done this before," he observed. "Every day for 20 years. Clara said, emerging with a basket full of eggs. "My father always said I had a way with animals. They trust me, for some reason." At the barn, Ben watched in amazement as Clara examined his milk cow, Bessie, with the practiced eye of someone who knew what she was looking at. She ran her hands along the cow's sides, checking for any signs of illness or injury, then positioned the milking stool and got to work. "She's in good health," Clara told him as she worked. "Good muscle tone, clear eyes, and her bag feels normal. You've been taking good care of her." Ben felt that surge of pride again. He had always tried to do right by his animals, but it was different hearing it from someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. As they moved through the morning chores, Ben found himself seeing his ranch through Clara's eyes. She noticed things he had stopped seeing. The way the morning light hit the barn, the sound of the cattle calling to each other, the view of the mountains from the pasture. Her presence made him remember why he had once loved this place, before loneliness had turned it into just a place to work and sleep. "Your father chose a beautiful spot for his ranch," Clara said as they walked back toward the house. "You can see for miles in every direction." "He always said he wanted to build somewhere that would make my mother happy," Ben replied. "She loved the mountains." "She had good taste," Clara said. "This feels like the kind of place where you could build a real life." There was something wistful in her voice that made Ben look at her sideways. "What was your place like?" "In Texas?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Smaller than this, drier. We grew cotton mostly and kept a few animals. It was a good life until—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "Well, until it wasn't anymore." Ben wanted to ask more, but he could see that talking about her past was painful for her. Instead, he pointed toward a section of fence that needed repair. "I was going to work on that this morning. The winter was hard on the wood. Mind if I help?" Clara asked. "I'm pretty good with a hammer." Ben was skeptical until he saw her work. Clara handled tools like she had been born with them in her hands, and she could spot a loose post or a weak board from 20 feet away. Together they repaired more fence in 2 hours than Ben usually managed in a whole day working alone. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked as they gathered up their tools. "My father," Clara said simply. "He always said that anyone who owned land should know how to take care of it properly. So he taught me everything he knew: carpentry, animal husbandry, crop rotation, weather prediction. He said knowledge was the one thing that nobody could take away from you." As they walked back to the house for the midday meal, Ben found himself thinking about how different this morning had been from every other morning he had spent alone on the ranch. Having Clara there had turned work into something that felt more like partnership. She hadn't just helped him, she had made him better at his own job by seeing things he had missed. By bringing her own knowledge and experience to bear on problems he had been solving the same way for years. More than that, having someone to talk to while he worked had made the time pass quickly and pleasantly. Ben realized he had been smiling more in the past 2 hours than he had in the past 2 months. Over lunch, Clara asked intelligent questions about his ranch, how many head of cattle he ran, what his annual expenses were like, whether he had considered diversifying into other crops or animals. Her questions made Ben think about his operation in ways he hadn't in years, made him see possibilities he had stopped considering. "You could do well with sheep too in this climate," Clara suggested. "The wool market is strong and they don't require as much pasture per animal as cattle do." "I've thought about it," Ben admitted, "but I've never known much about sheep." "I do," Clara said. "We had a small flock back home. They're not that different from cattle, really, just smaller and more opinionated." Ben laughed, and the sound surprised him. When was the last time he had laughed out loud? When was the last time he had enjoyed a conversation this much? As the afternoon wore on, Ben found himself dreading the trip to town that he knew they would have to make tomorrow. Not because he didn't want to help Clara find Thomas McKinnon, but because he didn't want this strange, comfortable interlude to end. For the first time in 15 years, his house felt like more than just a place to sleep. It felt like a home, and Clara felt like she belonged here in a way that made no logical sense. She had been here less than 24 hours, but already Ben couldn't imagine the place without her. The thought of going back to eating meals alone, working alone and spending his evenings in silence made something inside him ache in a way he hadn't felt since his parents died. He tried to tell himself that it was just because he had been alone for so long that any company would feel this good, but deep down he knew it was more than that. There was something about Clara specifically, her competence, her easy laughter, her way of making him feel like the best version of himself. That made him want things he had convinced himself he didn't need. As evening approached, and they prepared to share another meal together, Ben found himself hoping that somehow, some way, tomorrow wouldn't come quite as quickly as it usually did. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Perfect weather for the 15-mile journey to Cedar Falls. Ben hitched up his wagon while Clara gathered her belongings, both of them moving slower than necessary, as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change what had to happen. Clara appeared on the porch carrying her carpet bag and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. She had changed into her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and had taken extra care with her hair. Ben realized she was preparing to meet the man she might marry, and the thought made his stomach twist in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. "You look nice," he said, helping her up onto the wagon seat, and immediately felt foolish for saying something so simple. "Thank you," Clara replied, settling her skirts around her. "I suppose first impressions matter, even in arrangements like this." As they set off down the road, Ben found himself trying to memorize everything about the moment. The way Clara sat beside him, the sound of her voice as she pointed out wildflowers growing along the roadside, the way the morning sun caught the copper highlights in her dark hair. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he barely knew this woman, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wagon ride was precious in a way he couldn't explain. "Tell me about Thomas McKinnon," Clara said as they rolled through the countryside. "You said he runs the dry goods store?" Ben nodded, trying to focus on giving her useful information instead of dwelling on his own strange feelings. "He's a good man from what I know of him. Honest in his business dealings, goes to church regular. His wife died about 3 years ago. Left him with a store to run and no children. He's probably in his 40s, maybe a little older. What's he like? As a person, I mean?" Ben thought about it. "Quiet sort of fellow. Polite. He's always been fair with me when I've had dealings with him." "I don't know him well enough to say much more than that." Clara was quiet for a moment. It's strange, isn't it? The idea of marrying someone you don't know at all. I mean, you can exchange letters, but letters only tell you so much about a person. Why did you decide to do it? Ben asked gently. Answer the advertisement, I mean. Clara looked out at the passing landscape, her hands folded in her lap. After my father died, I tried to keep the farm going on my own for about 6 months. But between the debts he owed and the men who thought a woman alone was easy prey, it became impossible. I could have tried to find work in San Antonio, but the only jobs available to women don't pay enough to live on. And some of them... She shook her head. Let's just say they weren't jobs I was willing to take. Ben felt that anger rise in him again at the thought of Clara being put in such an impossible position. So you decided marriage was the safest option? The most practical option, Clara corrected. I figured that if I had to depend on a man anyway, it might as well be one who was offering marriage and respectability in exchange for companionship and domestic help. At least then I'd have some legal protection and a proper place in society. That's a hell of a way to have to think about your life, Ben said, then immediately apologized for his language. Clara smiled at his embarrassment. Ben, I grew up on a farm with a father who had been a soldier. I've heard worse language than that. And you're right. It is a hell of a way to have to think about your life, but sometimes you work with what you've got instead of what you wish you had. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Ben found himself thinking about the practical considerations that had driven Clara to this point, and about how different her life might have been if the world were a fairer place for women alone. He also found himself thinking about how much he had enjoyed having her at the ranch, how right she had seemed in his kitchen and working beside him with the animals. What about you? Clara asked eventually. Have you ever thought about marriage? The question caught Ben off guard. Not really, he said. I mean, there was a time when I thought, but that was a long time ago, before your parents died. Ben nodded. There was a girl I knew when I was younger. We talked about getting married someday, but after my mother died and then my father, I guess I decided I wasn't cut out for that kind of life. What happened to her? The girl you knew? She married someone else. Had 3 children last I heard. She's probably happy. Ben paused, then added, she deserved someone who could give her a real family, not someone who was too scared of losing people to let himself love them properly. Clara looked at him with something like understanding in her eyes. Love is always a risk, she said quietly, but so is being alone. Is that why you're willing to marry a stranger? Because being alone is riskier than taking a chance on someone you don't know. Clara considered this, partly, but also because I think maybe 2 people who are honest with each other about what they need can build something good together. Even if it doesn't start with romance. Maybe especially if it doesn't start with romance. What do you mean? When people fall in love first, they sometimes don't see each other clearly. They see what they want to see, or what they hope the other person is. But when you start with practical considerations, with knowing what you can offer and what you need in return, maybe you have a better chance of building something that lasts. Ben thought about this as they continued down the road. There was wisdom in what Clara was saying, but it also made him sad in a way he couldn't quite explain. The idea of marriage as a business arrangement, even a kind and respectful one, seemed to leave out something important. But then again, what did he know about it? He had spent 15 years avoiding any kind of emotional risk at all. As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Ben felt his chest getting tighter with each mile. Soon they would be at Thomas McKinnon's store, and Clara would meet the man she had traveled hundreds of miles to marry. Ben would help her get settled, make sure she was safe, and then drive home alone to his empty house. The thought of that empty house, which had been his refuge for so long, now seemed unbearable. 2 days with Clara had shown him what he had been missing, had reminded him of what it felt like to share meals and conversation and work with another person. Going back to his solitary life now would be like trying to fit into clothes he had outgrown. Ben, Clara said as they reached the main street of Cedar Falls, I want to thank you for taking me in, for helping me, for being so kind to a stranger. Not many men would have done what you've done. Anyone would have helped, Ben said, but Clara shook her head. No, they wouldn't have. Trust me on that. She paused, then added, these past 2 days have been, well, they've been some of the happiest I've had in a long time. I want you to know that. Ben looked at her, seeing something in her eyes that made his heart skip. For me too, he said quietly. They pulled up in front of McKinnon's Dry Goods just as Thomas McKinnon himself was opening the store for the day. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and kind eyes, and he looked up at the sound of their wagon with a polite smile that faltered when he saw Clara. "Mr. McKinnon?" Ben called out. "I believe this lady has been looking for you." Thomas McKinnon's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked almost like panic. He glanced back at his store, then at Clara, then back at his store again. "Miss Santos?" he said hesitantly. "From the matrimonial agency?" Clara climbed down from the wagon, her chin held high despite what Ben could see was growing apprehension. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry I'm late. There was some confusion with the directions and I ended up at Mr. Walker's ranch by mistake." Thomas McKinnon looked incredibly uncomfortable. He glanced around the street as if hoping someone might appear to help him with this awkward situation. "Miss Santos," he said finally, "I'm afraid there's been a complication. When you didn't arrive on the expected day, I assumed, that is, I thought you had changed your mind. And there's a widow here in town, Mrs. Catherine Fisher, who has been... That is, we've become..." Ben watched Clara's face as understanding dawned on her. Thomas McKinnon was trying to tell her that he had already made other arrangements, that her place as his intended bride had been filled by someone else. "You're married," Clara said simply. "As of yesterday morning," Thomas confirmed, looking miserable about having to deliver this news. "I'm truly sorry, Miss Santos. If I had known you were still coming..." Clara stood very still for a long moment and Ben could see her processing this latest blow to her already uncertain future. Then she straightened her shoulders and managed a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring. "Congratulations," she said, and Ben could tell she meant it. "I hope you'll be very happy together." Thomas McKinnon looked relieved that she was taking the news so gracefully. "Is there anything I can do to help? Do you need money for passage back to Texas? I feel terrible about this misunderstanding." Clara opened her mouth to reply, but Ben found himself speaking before she could answer. "That's all right," he heard himself say. "Clara's going to be staying at my ranch for a while, until she decides what she wants to do next." Both Clara and Thomas looked at him in surprise. Clara's eyes were wide with something that might have been hope, while Thomas just looked relieved that the problem was being solved by someone else. The weeks that followed their return from town settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and carefully constructed. Clara had insisted on earning her keep, taking over the household duties with an efficiency that amazed Ben. She cleaned 15 years of bachelor living out of his house, organized his kitchen like a military operation, and somehow managed to make meals out of ingredients he had never thought to combine. But more than that, she had begun to make changes that transformed the ranch from a place where Ben simply worked and slept into something that felt alive again. She planted a vegetable garden behind the house, coaxing impressive yields from soil that Ben had never thought to cultivate. She convinced him to let her fix up the old chicken coop, and soon they had fresh eggs every morning and extra to sell in town. "You've got a good setup here," Clara said one morning as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a summer storm. "With a little investment and some better organization, this ranch could be really profitable." Ben paused in his hammering to look at her. "What kind of investment?" "Well, you've got good grazing land, but you're not using all of it. You could expand your herd, or like I mentioned before, add some sheep, and that back pasture near the creek would be perfect for growing hay. You could sell the surplus to other ranchers instead of buying feed every winter." Ben had thought about some of these things over the years, but he had never had anyone to discuss them with, and the prospect of making big changes alone had seemed overwhelming. Having Clara there to talk through the possibilities made them seem achievable in a way they never had before. "You really think it could work?" he asked. "I know it could," Clara said with confidence. "My father always said that land wants to be productive. You just have to listen to what it's trying to tell you." They had fallen into the habit of taking their evening coffee on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains while they talked about their days. These conversations had become the part of each day that Ben looked forward to most. Clara was easy to talk to, with opinions about everything from politics to the best way to train a horse. And she had a way of listening that made Ben feel like his thoughts were worth hearing. One evening in late August, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara brought up something that had been on both their minds but that neither had quite dared to address directly. "Ben," she said, "I've been thinking about my situation here, and I want to make sure we're both clear about the arrangement." Ben felt his stomach tighten. This was the conversation he had been dreading, the one where Clara would tell him she had decided to move on, maybe try to find work in a bigger town, or save up money to go back to Texas. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I mean that I'm living in your house, eating your food and using your resources, and while I'm trying to contribute what I can, I don't want you to feel like you're responsible for taking care of me indefinitely. We should probably talk about what the long-term plan is." Ben was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. The truth was he didn't want there to be a long-term plan that involved Clara leaving. The past few weeks had been the happiest he could remember, and the thought of going back to his solitary life made his chest ache. "Are you unhappy here?" he asked finally. "No," Clara said quickly. "No, that's not what I meant at all. I've been happier here than I've been in a very long time. This place feels like home in a way that nowhere has since my father died." Ben felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Then why are we talking about long-term plans?" Clara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "Because I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You offered me a place to stay while I figured out what to do next. But I think we both know that I've been putting off figuring anything out because I don't want to leave." "What if I don't want you to leave either?" Ben asked, the words coming out before he could stop them. Clara turned to look at him, and in the fading light he could see something hopeful and scared in her eyes. "What are you saying?" Ben took a deep breath. This was the kind of conversation he had been avoiding for 15 years, the kind that required him to be honest about what he wanted instead of just accepting what he had. "I'm saying that having you here has made me realize how empty my life was before. I'm saying that I look forward to seeing you every morning and I dread the thought of you not being here. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this stopped being about helping a stranger and started being about wanting you to stay." Clara was quiet for so long that Ben began to worry he had said too much, that he had made her uncomfortable by revealing feelings she didn't share. But when she finally spoke, her voice was warm with something that might have been relief. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted. "But I wasn't sure if you were just being kind or if you might actually want me here for other reasons." "What kind of other reasons?" Ben asked, though he thought he knew what she meant. "The kind where two people build a life together instead of just sharing a house," Clara said quietly. "The kind where this becomes permanent because we both want it to, not just because neither of us knows what else to do." Ben reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm from the work they had been doing together. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." Clara squeezed his hand. "So would I. But Ben, I want us to be honest about what we're talking about. I care about you more than I expected to, more than I thought I could care about anyone I'd known for such a short time. But this isn't exactly a typical courtship, is it?" Ben understood what she was asking. They had skipped all the usual steps of getting to know each other, had moved straight to living together and working together and building something that looked like a partnership. The feelings between them were real, but they had developed in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. "No, it's not typical," he agreed, "but maybe that's not a bad thing. We've seen each other at our worst and our best. We know we can work together and live together without driving each other crazy. Maybe that's a better foundation than most couples start with." Clara smiled at that. "My parents always said that marriage was more about partnership than romance. They said the butterflies and excitement would fade, but the ability to work together and respect each other would last." "Were they happy?" Ben asked. "Very," Clara said. "They were best friends as much as they were husband and wife. I used to hope I'd find something like that someday." Ben felt something warm spread through his chest at her words. "Maybe you have," he said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them processing what they had just admitted to each other. Finally, Clara spoke again. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "I don't know," Ben admitted. "I've never been in this situation before. Usually people court first and then move in together, not the other way around." Clara laughed at that. "Well, we've never been conventional, have we? Maybe we can figure out our own way of doing things." "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking that maybe we could try being honest with each other about what we want, instead of pretending we're just friends sharing a house." Maybe we could see if what we've built here could turn into something more intentional. Ben liked the sound of that. Intentional, he repeated. I like that word. Good, Clara said, because I have some thoughts about those expansion plans for the ranch. If we're going to be partners, we might as well make this place as successful as it can be. Ben found himself grinning at her practical approach to what most people would consider a romantic conversation. But that was Clara, always thinking about the future, always planning for what came next. It was one of the things he had come to love about her. Love. The word had slipped into his thoughts so naturally that it took him a moment to realize what he had just admitted to himself. He was in love with Clara Santos, this woman who had arrived at his ranch by mistake and had somehow made him remember what it felt like to be alive. He wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Wasn't sure if she felt the same way or if she was just being practical about their situation. But for the first time in 15 years, Ben Walker was thinking about the future, with hope instead of resignation. And that future included Clara, permanently and intentionally and with all the partnership and companionship and, yes, love, that they could build together. September brought the first hints of autumn to the Montana mountains, and with it a change in the rhythm of life at the ranch. The summer crops were ready for harvest, the cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture, and there was the constant work of preparing for the cold months ahead. Ben and Clara worked together with an efficiency born of growing familiarity and mutual respect. But underneath the comfortable routine, something deeper was building. Ben found himself watching Clara more often, noticing the way she hummed while she worked, the way she talked gently to the animals, the way her face lit up when she laughed at something he said. He caught himself thinking about her when they were apart, even if it was just for the few hours when he rode to the far pastures to check on the cattle. The realization that he was falling in love with her had settled into his consciousness like a warm, steady flame. Clara, for her part, had begun to think of the ranch as truly home in a way that went beyond just having a place to live. She found herself making plans that extended far into the future. Where to plant fruit trees next spring, how to expand the vegetable garden, which improvements would make the most difference to the ranch's profitability. These weren't the thoughts of someone planning to leave. These were the thoughts of someone building a life. The question of marriage hung unspoken between them, present in every shared meal, every evening conversation on the porch, every moment when their hands brushed as they worked side by side. Both of them knew that their arrangement, while perfectly proper on the surface, could not continue indefinitely without causing talk in town. More importantly, both of them wanted something more permanent than their current understanding. The crisis that forced the conversation came in early October, when Mrs. Patterson from the general store made one of her periodic visits to deliver supplies and collect gossip. She was a kind woman, but she had strong opinions about proper behavior, and she was not shy about sharing them. "Ben Walker," she said as she climbed down from her wagon, "I hope you know what you're doing, keeping that young woman out here without proper supervision." Ben felt his jaw tighten. Clara is a grown woman who can make her own decisions about where she lives. "Mrs. Patterson." "That may be," the older woman replied, "but appearances matter, especially for a woman in her position. People are starting to talk and not all of it is kind." Clara appeared from the garden where she had been harvesting the last of the summer squash, her skirts pinned up and dirt on her hands. She looked healthy and happy and completely at home, which only seemed to make Mrs. Patterson more concerned. "Miss Santos," Mrs. Patterson said, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Clara looked questioningly at Ben, who nodded reluctantly. He busied himself unloading supplies while the two women walked toward the house. But he could see Mrs. Patterson's animated gestures and Clara's increasingly rigid posture. When Mrs. Patterson left an hour later, Clara stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear down the road, her face unreadable. Ben approached her carefully, not sure what had been said but certain from her expression that it hadn't been pleasant. "What did she want to talk to you about?" he asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "She thinks I'm ruining my reputation by living here unmarried. She says people in town are starting to say things about me, about us. She suggested that I should either find a position as a governess or housekeeper somewhere, or convince you to marry me quickly before the talk gets worse." Ben felt anger rise in his chest. "What people say is none of their business, isn't it?" Clara asked, turning to face him. "Ben, Mrs. Patterson is right about one thing. The way we're living now can't continue indefinitely without consequences. If people start thinking of me as your mistress instead of your whatever I am, it will affect both of us. You'll be seen as taking advantage of a woman in a vulnerable position, and I'll be seen as a woman of loose morals." Ben knew she was right, but the practical nature of the conversation frustrated him. "So what do you want to do?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I don't want to leave, Ben. I've been happier here than I've ever been anywhere. But I also don't want to damage your reputation or put you in an impossible position." That evening, Ben sat by the fire long after Clara had gone to bed, thinking about what Mrs. Patterson had said and what it meant for their future. He had been content to let their relationship develop naturally, to see where their growing feelings would lead without putting pressure on either of them. But Mrs. Patterson's visit had made it clear that the outside world would not allow them that luxury. The truth was, Ben had been thinking about marriage for weeks, but he had been afraid to bring it up. Their relationship had developed under such unusual circumstances that he wasn't sure if Clara's feelings for him were genuine or if she was just grateful for his help and making the best of her situation. The last thing he wanted was to pressure her into a marriage she didn't really want, but Mrs. Patterson's visit had made it clear that they couldn't continue in their current state of uncertainty. Either they needed to formalize their relationship, or Clara would need to leave to protect both their reputations. And the thought of Clara leaving was unbearable. The next evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Ben finally found the courage to address the situation directly. "Clara," he said, "we need to talk about what Mrs. Patterson said yesterday." Clara nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about it too. Have you come to any conclusions?" Clara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains. "I think she's right about the practical considerations. We can't go on like this indefinitely. But Ben, I don't want any decisions we make to be based on what other people think we should do. If we're going to change our situation, it should be because we want to, not because we feel pressured by gossip." Ben took a deep breath. This was the conversation he had been both anticipating and dreading, the one that would determine the course of his future. "Clara," he said, "I want to ask you something, but I want you to feel completely free to say no if it's not what you want. I don't want you to feel obligated because of the situation we're in." Clara turned to look at him, something hopeful and nervous in her eyes. "What do you want to ask me?" Ben stood up and walked to the porch railing, needing the movement to calm his nerves. When he turned back to face her, he saw that she was watching him intently. "I know this isn't how these things usually happen," he began. "I know we haven't known each other very long, and I know our relationship started under circumstances that were unusual. But Clara, these past few months have been the happiest of my life." Clara's expression softened, but she didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "When you first arrived here, I thought I was content with my life alone. I thought I had everything I needed. But having you here has shown me what I was missing. You've made this place feel like a home again. You've made me feel like a whole person again." Ben paused, trying to find the right words for what he wanted to say. "I love working beside you and talking with you and planning for the future with you. I love the way you make me laugh and the way you're not afraid to tell me when you think I'm wrong about something. I love the way you've brought this ranch back to life." He took another deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is that I've fallen in love with you, Clara. Not just grateful for your help, not just comfortable with the arrangement we have, but truly in love with you. And if you feel anything like the same way, I would be honored if you would consider marrying me." Clara was very still for a long moment, and Ben felt his heart beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. Then tears began to slide down her cheeks and she stood up to face him. "Ben Walker," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you because you love me? Or because Mrs. Patterson thinks you should?" "Because I love you," Ben said without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson just gave me the push I needed to stop being a coward about saying so." Clara smiled through her tears. "Good answer. Is that a yes?" Ben asked, hardly daring to hope. "That's a yes," Clara said, and then she was in his arms and Ben was holding her like he never wanted to let her go. "Are you sure?" he asked against her hair. "I know this isn't the life you planned when you left Texas." Clara pulled back to look at him. "Ben, I planned to marry a stranger and try to build something decent out of necessity. Instead, I found someone I genuinely love and who loves me back. I found a place where I belong and work that matters to me. This is so much better than anything I planned." Ben kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "So when do you want to do this?" Clara asked. "As soon as possible," Ben said. "I want the whole world to know that you're my wife, that you belong here, that no one has any right to question your place in my life." Clara laughed. "I like the sound of that. But Ben, I want to do this right. I want a real wedding, even if it's small. I want to feel like I'm choosing this completely, not just solving a problem." "We'll do whatever you want," Ben promised. "Take as much time as you need." "I don't need much time," Clara said. "I already know what I want. I want to marry you, Ben Walker, and I want to build a life here that we can both be proud of." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in November, giving them just enough time to make the necessary arrangements without a lengthy engagement that would fuel more gossip. Ben rode to town the day after his proposal to speak with Pastor Williams about the ceremony, and found the elderly minister both surprised and delighted by the news. "I have to admit," Pastor Williams said with a knowing smile, "I've been wondering when you two would make this official. Anyone with eyes could see that you belong together." Ben felt his face warm. "Were we that obvious?" "To those of us who've been watching you both, yes. Miss Santos lights up when she talks about the ranch, and you, well, you look like a man who's found his purpose again. It's been good to see." The preparations for the wedding were simple but heartfelt. Clara had written to her cousin in San Antonio, the only family she had left, but received word that the woman couldn't make the journey. Ben's nearest relatives lived back east and would never make it in time, but the people of Cedar Falls, once they heard the news, rallied around them with an enthusiasm that surprised both Ben and Clara. Mrs. Patterson, apparently feeling vindicated in her earlier concerns, insisted on organizing a wedding feast. "It's not proper for a bride to have to cook her own wedding dinner," she declared, and recruited half the women in town to help with the preparations. Joe Miller, Ben's nearest neighbor, offered to host the reception at his larger ranch house. "You two deserve a proper celebration," he said, "and my place can hold more people than yours." Even Thomas McKinnon and his new wife Catherine came by the ranch to offer their congratulations and Catherine's wedding dress, which she had carefully preserved. "I'd be honored if you'd wear it," Catherine told Clara. "It seems fitting somehow. Since your story started with Thomas and me." In a way, Clara accepted the dress gratefully, touched by the kindness of people who had started as strangers and were quickly becoming friends. The dress needed only minor alterations, and when Clara tried it on, she looked every inch the radiant bride. The week before the wedding, Ben found himself nervous in a way he hadn't expected. Not about marrying Clara. He was more certain of that decision than he had ever been about anything in his life. But about whether he could be the husband she deserved, whether he could give her the kind of life she had dreamed of. Clara seemed to sense his anxiety during one of their evening conversations on the porch. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked gently. "Not about marrying you," Ben said quickly. "Never about that. I guess I'm just scared that I won't know how to be a good husband. I've been alone for so long I'm not sure I remember how to share my life with someone." Clara reached over and took his hand. "Ben, you've been sharing your life with me for months now. You've been kind and generous and patient, and you've made me feel valued and safe and loved. If that's not knowing how to be a good husband, I don't know what is. But what if I disappoint you? What if married life isn't what you hoped it would be?" Clara smiled at him with such warmth that it made his chest tight. "Ben Walker, do you remember what my life was like when I got on that stagecoach in San Antonio? I was desperate enough to marry a complete stranger just to have a roof over my head and some security. Instead, I found a man who makes me laugh every day, who values my opinions, who works beside me as an equal partner, and who looks at me like I'm the most precious thing in the world. Trust me when I say that whatever married life brings us, it's already far better than anything I dared to hope for." The wedding day dawned clear and cold. With the first snow of the season dusting the mountains like powdered sugar, Clara woke early in the room that had been hers since that first night, looking around at the space that had become so familiar. Tomorrow night she would be sleeping in Ben's room as his wife, and the thought filled her with nervous excitement. Ben had spent the night at Joe Miller's ranch, observing the tradition that the bride and groom shouldn't see each other on their wedding day until the ceremony. He was up before dawn, pacing Joe's kitchen and drinking coffee that tasted like mud. Relax, son, Joe said, watching Ben wear a path in his floorboards. You're acting like a man heading to his execution instead of his wedding. I just want everything to be perfect for her, Ben said. Clara deserves the best day possible. And she'll have it, Joe assured him. Not because everything goes according to plan, but because she's marrying a man who loves her enough to pace holes in my floor worrying about her happiness. The ceremony was held at 2:00 in the afternoon at the small church in Cedar Falls. Clara arrived in a wagon, decorated with late autumn flowers, driven by Pastor Williams' son, since Ben was already waiting at the altar. When the church doors opened and Clara appeared in Catherine's white dress with her dark hair, pinned up under a simple veil, Ben felt his breath catch in his throat. She was beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy. As she walked down the aisle toward him, her eyes never left his face, and the smile she wore was radiant with joy and certainty. When she reached him, Ben took her hands and found that his own were shaking. You look beautiful, he whispered. So do you, Clara whispered back, and Ben realized she was right. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like his life was beautiful. Pastor Williams kept the ceremony simple and heartfelt, speaking about the blessing of finding love in unexpected places, and the importance of building a marriage on friendship and mutual respect. When it came time for the vows, Ben and Clara had chosen to speak their own words. Clara, Ben said, his voice steady despite his nerves, when you arrived at my ranch, I thought you were just a lost traveler who needed help. I had no idea you were actually finding your way home. You've brought light back into my life and made me remember what it feels like to hope for the future. I promise to love you, to work beside you, to listen to your dreams, and to build a life with you that makes us both proud. Clara's eyes were bright with tears as she responded. Ben, you took in a stranger with nothing to offer but gratitude, and you gave me not just shelter but a place to belong. You've shown me what it means to be truly partnered with someone, to have your contributions valued and your opinions respected. I promise to love you, to support your dreams, to work beside you through whatever comes, and to make our home a place of joy and peace for as long as we both shall live. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause. Ben kissed Clara softly, sweetly, sealing their commitment in front of their community. As they walked back down the aisle together, Clara's hand tucked into the crook of Ben's arm. Both of them were glowing with happiness. The reception at Joe Miller's ranch was everything Ben and Clara could have hoped for. The tables groaned under the weight of food that the townswomen had prepared, and there was music and dancing and toasts that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Mrs. Patterson gave a speech about the importance of taking chances on love, and even Thomas McKinnon stood up to wish them well, expressing his gratitude that the mix-up with the matrimonial agency had led to such happiness for everyone involved. As the evening wound down and guests began to head home, Ben and Clara found themselves standing on Joe's front porch, looking up at the stars that seemed particularly bright against the crisp November sky. How do you feel, Mrs. Walker? Ben asked, still amazed that he could call her that. Like the luckiest woman in Montana, Clara replied, leaning against his side. How do you feel, Mr. Walker? Like a man who's been given a second chance at life, Ben said, wrapping his arms around her. Like a man who's finally home. They drove back to their ranch in the moonlight, both of them quiet with the contentment that comes after a perfect day. The house looked the same as always, but everything felt different now. This was their home, officially and permanently, the place where they would build their future together. Their first year of marriage brought challenges that tested their partnership and their love. A harsh winter killed several head of cattle, forcing them to dip into their savings and make difficult decisions about the future of the ranch. Clara came down with pneumonia in February, and for 2 terrifying weeks Ben barely left her side, nursing her back to health with a devotion that surprised them both with its intensity. But the challenges also brought them closer together. They learned to communicate about money and worry and fear, to support each other through the difficult times without losing sight of their shared goals. They learned that love wasn't just the easy moments of joy and passion, but also the hard work of standing by each other when things got tough. Spring brought renewal and new hope. Clara's vegetable garden, expanded and improved from the previous year, promised to be their most productive yet. The cattle had survived the winter better than expected, and Ben had taken Clara's advice about diversifying their income by adding a small flock of sheep. The wool market was indeed strong, and the additional income gave them the security to plan for the future with confidence. But the greatest joy of that spring came in May, when Clara told Ben that she was expecting their first child. They had been hoping for this news since their wedding night, but when it finally came, Ben was overwhelmed with an emotion so powerful it brought him to his knees. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands shaking as he held her face.